23. It was 8 in the morning on January 7th, 9 hours after a great gamble in the Grand Casino. Asuna, Argo, Kismel, Kyo, Nanir, and I made up a party of 6, heading quickly across the Field of Bones on the west side of the 7th floor of Eincrad. While it was a 6-person party, only 4 of us could really fight. Nanir was still in a coma, wrapped in a heavy cloak and a cape to shut out the sunlight, and Kyo had her master secured tightly to her back with leather straps. The Field of Bones, meanwhile, was a desolate wasteland, with dead trees that stuck out of the ground like bones. There was virtually no green plant life to be seen. As an elf, Kismel would normally be hit with a weakness debuff in less than a minute here. But fortunately for us, she still had the green leaf cape she'd borrowed from the treasury of Castle Galley, which kept her from suffering in the arid landscape. According to her, when leaving Castle Galley for Harin Tree Palace, she'd been given the treasured cape to use by Bohrum, the older man in charge of the treasury at the castle. Surely, he hadn't anticipated that Kismel would need it after escaping the prison and going off to reclaim the keys. But the ancient steak eater was a man of many mysteries. One day, I wanted to return to the castle to grill him about the meditation skill, and maybe get a chance to eat that hamburger steak I missed out on. What had he called it? A fricatelle? 2. But we couldn't even approach the Dark Elf territories until we discovered the stolen keys. Frankly, it had felt like we were grasping at straws in the quest to get the keys back, but now we had finally found the thread we could follow to victory, and it was leading us towards 2 small figures flickering on the far end of the bleached wasteland. 7 hours ago, Asa and I returned to the 3rd floor hotel room after negotiating with the 2 guilds. We gave a report to the group and decided at last to make use of the item for contacting the fallen elves, the map of Skya. The location we indicated was a pair of aspen trees that stood on the path from Volupta to Lucerrock Forest. The time was 3 o'clock in the morning. I accepted the job of dripping the blood. Kismel was very insistent that she should do it, but Bardun was a human being, and if elf blood just so happened to cause a different reaction in the map, the Fallen would know it was a trap. Somehow, I managed to convince Kismel of this, and so she stood back while I attempted to prick my finger with a thin knife from Kyo. This was when Asuna, Argo, and I belatedly realized a major problem. Nanir's room and the rest of Volupta, of course, was inside the anti-criminal code zone, where players could not harm other players. That included oneself, of course. Jabbing at my finger with a knife just brought up a purple system wall in the air. Kismel rolled her eyes at the overprotective nature of humankind's magic, and tried to take the knife from me. But Argo fortunately came up with a solution. There was one way to temporarily cancel the safety code within the safe zone of town, with the dueling system. I challenged Asuna to a first strike duel, which she accepted with a suspicious look, making a huge countdown window appear overhead. The 60 seconds passed as agonizingly slow as I remember them doing before, and once the duel had begun, I was able to prick the tip of my finger with the knife. The blood in this case was not realistic liquid, but shining red bits of light. I dripped the first one over the aspen trees on the map. Next, I added a second drop over the mark on the edge of the map corresponding to 3 in the morning. A sharp little needle of red light extended about 2 inches from that spot and began to tick down each second. In a minute, the light was gone, and there was nothing to do but trust in the map and wait. 3 minutes later, a blue pillar appeared over the map this time. It was not indicating the same place and time, however. The location was an especially large dead tree standing in the middle of the field of bones, far to the northwest of Volupta, and the time was 7 in the morning. Clearly, the fallen elves had indicated a new time and place, as though to say, "We're not following your instructions." We couldn't just spurn this counteroffer, so I was going to approve when I came up short. Where was I supposed to drip the blood to indicate acceptance? The group erupted into suggestions and arguments until Kyo spotted 2 oddly shaped letters for Y and N in the corner of the map. 2 minutes had passed since the Fallen's response by then, so I quickly added a new drop on the Y. We waited 5 more minutes just in case, but another pillar of light did not appear, so we allowed the duel to end as a draw. We left the map out on the table and took a late dinner with some light food Asuna brought out in town. It was a waste of time to travel back to the Amber Moon Inn, so we just chose to sleep in the hotel. Then we got up at 4 o'clock, took 30 minutes to get ready, left the casino through that hidden passage again, and exited the town from the northern gate, hurrying northwest. There were monsters along the way, of course, but we had Kismel, the elite level NPC. In the town, she kept her broken saber on hand, but out in the wilderness, Kismel had to give up and switch to the elven stout sword I gave her. The utter power she exhibited made it clear that unfamiliarity with the weapon was no issue. After how helpless Kismel had been against Kaisara, the ransacker, thinking about the eventual second confrontation with that foe made my legs turn to jelly. At least Kaisara wasn't going to gain any levels in the meantime, though. We just had to make the most of our time to power up before then. With this thought and more passing through my mind, I gained a level on the trip, as did Asuna, putting us at 23 and 22 respectively. Argo had been busy leveling up on her own time, but as usual she declined to tell us the number or skill selection. Her claw attacks were even faster than Kismel's, and although the damage itself was low, she wreaked havoc on the monsters and kept them distracted while we unleashed big attacks. And even with Nanir strapped to her back, unable to move in any violent fashion, Q managed to shatter many foes with precise, high-powered thrusts from her Astok, if they were foolish enough to stand in her way. The party crossed the grassland that surrounded Volupta without stopping. Looser rock forest distant on the right-hand side as we continued northwest, until the sky began to grow light just as we reached the Field of Bones. As the most dangerous outdoor region on the 7th floor, the monsters were definitely a rank higher than elsewhere, but not enough to give us serious trouble. The only struggle was against a pack of rusty Lycians, real ones this time. Q sprinkled a strange-smelling liquid, however, which dulled the movement of the Lycians and made it much easier to defeat them. It was occurring to me now that between the rubarium flower dye that started this whole incident, the lobelia flower poison that we used to put Ninir to sleep, and the slow silver poison in her veins, the Cremulia incense used to create the spotlight debuff, and the strange liquid Kyo used on the pack of rusty Lycans, there was certainly a lot of poison and powder going around right now. That was probably because the Korloy and Notch toys were adept with medicine and mixtures, but perhaps there was some connection to the fact that Nanir was a vampire, or Lord of the Night. In the meantime, we crossed the Field of Bones and arrived at a hill with a good view of the huge dead tree, the Dragon Bone. 30 minutes before the meeting time, the elves demanded. There were a number of perfectly serviceable rocks atop the hill that offered us a hiding spot. We took turns watching the huge tree and took the time to rest and refuel. The morning sun was already shining through the outer aperture of Eincrad, which made me worry that Nanir would start taking damage despite the cloak and cape. But according to Kyo, she would be fine during her coma as long as she was not exposed to direct sunlight. I thought back on her walk through the setting sun before the stables, and recalled that she had weakened but not lost any HP. Still, the silver poisoning was bringing Nanir close to death, bit by bit. Our time limit was tomorrow evening. We had to find the fallen elf hideout and defeat the floor boss before then. There wasn't a moment to waste. I watched and waited impatiently, and around 6:55, Argo spotted two figures approaching from the opposite side of the wasteland. Our hiding spot was over 300 yards away from the dragon bone, so the figures were just black dots in the distance. But that was all Kismel needed to say. They have fallen. The fallen elves were still elves, so ordinarily they wouldn't be able to cross the field of bones without using something akin to the Greenleaf Cape. But like the soldiers who attacked the castle galley on the 6th floor, they were surely equipped with the taboo branches. Perhaps they had selected the field of bones, assuming that no dark elf from Harintri Palace could get anywhere close. I watched the two fallen elves reach the dragon bone. Of course, we couldn't leave our hiding spot. If we snuck up from the opposite side of the tree and performed an ambush, we could probably beat them, assuming they weren't Kaisara and General Nolza. But they weren't going to give up the location of their hideout, even under torture. And more importantly, Asuna wouldn't approve of that. So we stayed crouched behind the rocks, prepared to wait as long as it took the fallen to move. Or so we thought. But as soon as it turned 7:05, the pair began walking in the direction they'd come. For a brief moment, I thought, you've wanted people to meet you in the middle of the wasteland. You gotta give them a bit longer than that. But then I remembered we were the ones who'd called them, not Bardun Corloy, and the sooner they went back home, the better for us. So now it was 8 o'clock, and we were hurrying to follow the fallen elves as they presumably returned to their hideout. I was worried because there were few objects we could hide behind, but we had the sun at our backs, so the light shining off the bleached ground offered a kind of natural camouflage, I hoped. Either because we were in the midst of a special event, or because the Fallen had used some kind of magical charm several hundred yards ahead, there were no monster attacks, despite the fact we'd been walking for an hour since leaving the Dragonbone behind. At some point, the sharp mountain peaks beyond the wasteland and the labyrinth tower loomed behind them had become much clearer. I adjusted my walking speed so I lined up with Kyo, who was behind me. You've been carrying Lady Near this whole time. Are you okay? I'll switch with you if you're getting tired, I whispered. The ever-loyal battle maid gave me an exquisite glare. It is not a problem. I am not so weak I would become tired by carrying Lady Nenir on my own. Oh, of course, sorry, I said quickly. Her expression softened a bit. But I thank you for thinking of me. I must not forget that the job I hired you to do ended with the investigation of the stable. There is no way for me to express my gratitude that you have done so much to save Lady Ninir's life, beyond the point your mission was done. Gosh. I scratched behind my ear awkwardly, then cast a glance at Ninir, who was strapped to Kyo's back. Her face was hidden by the hood of her cloak, plus the cape over it. But there was a golden question mark rotating slowly over her head. It was the indicator that Ninir was currently my quest giver, and would not disappear until I finished, failed, or abandoned the quest. I wasn't going to choose the third option. That was for sure. Asuna and I didn't come to the casino to gamble. We came to Volupta to enjoy the beach, I said, looking back at Kyo. For a moment, Asuna looked over her shoulder from where she was walking with Kismel ahead of us. She wasn't scolding me for talking about it, so I continued the story. To get into the beach, you have to win 30,000 chips at the casino per person and get a pass, right? We'd never make that much playing normally at cards tables, roulette wheels, or the Monster Coliseum, of course. But we won 140,000 yesterday, enough for me, Asuna, Argo, and Kismel to get our own passes. And that was only because Lady Near hired us to do that job. At some point, I started losing track of what I was trying to say. A subtle smirk crossed Kyo's lips. If you had simply asked, we could have arranged beach passes at any moment. Huh? Really? The staircase pass we lent to Argo has essentially the same privileges. They can be given indefinitely to anyone hired by hotel owners. Oh, I didn't know. In that case, theoretically, we could have borrowed the pass directly after meeting Ninir, then gone straight to the beach, gotten our fill of the sun and sand, and abandoned the quest before heading right to the next town. But that would have left Argo to continue the quest on her own. So Ninir would presumably have been bitten by the Argent Serpent anyway. In that sense, I was glad we hadn't gotten any unscrupulous ideas, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to express that to her.
Even if my brother, Huazo, and I served the lady for all of our lives, Kyo continued quietly, we could never make up the debt we owe her. Do you recall that I said this before?
Yes, of course. I'd been wondering what she meant by that. Up ahead, Asuna and Kismel were listening in careful silence, as was Argo behind us.
Our father was a swordsman, originally in the Korloi family's employ.
It took all my willpower to stop myself from screaming, "What?" I managed to hold it to a simple nod, prompting Kyo to continue.
He worked in dangerous conditions every day on their monster capturing team. But when I was 6 and Huazo were 4, the team was ordered to capture a monster in the northern mountains called Amphision. They were successful at their mission, but there was one casualty. Our father.
Amphision was the name of an extinct type of large carnivore that lived 20 million years ago in the real world, and they were some of the toughest monsters on the 7th floor map. It was tough enough to kill them. Capturing them had to be a significant more dangerous. I wanted to close my eyes and offer a silent prayer to his memory, but I couldn't lose track of the shifting figures on the horizon, so I just nodded again.
At the time, our mother had already died of a plague, so the family was just the 3 of us. Now our father was dead, and because we lived in the Korloi's quarters, Huazo and I were driven out with nothing but the clothes on our backs.
I didn't fail to notice the way Asuna's hands balled into fists. I felt a flare of anger in my gut too, but held it back and focused on the horizon. Q gently adjusted Ninir on her back and resumed quietly.
We had nowhere to go, and nothing to eat. My brother and I would have surely joined our parents soon if we were left in the streets. But Lady Ninir was aware of our plight, and she sought us out in the back streets of Rupta and took us under the Notstoy family's wing. Although she was much taller than I was when we first met, I eventually outgrew her. But for the 13 years since, I have never wavered in my loyalty and gratitude to her. No matter what happens, I must always do everything I can to save her.
She let her left hand drop at the pommel of her asstock, then lifted it up, to hold the straps again. It was a struggle to hold down the smoldering anger toward Bardun Corloy that rested in the pit of my stomach. But there was a question I'd repeated to myself many times that was rising to mind once again. Were the events Q described actual things that happened 13 years ago in this world, before SAO's official launch? Or were they all just story points that had been programmed into her memory to serve as a background? But this was a pointless question. Asuna, Argo, and I were real human beings who were born and raised in the real world, and I knew we'd all been trapped in Aincrad due to Akihito Kayaba's sick criminal scheme. But there was no evidence that any of this was the truth. It could be that we were the AIs, just like Kyo, Kismel, and Anir, and that I was only being convinced that I was a player in a game by the name of Kirito, or Kazuto Kirigaya. "Thanks for telling us," said Asuna, the first to break the silence. Despite the fact that she was facing forward and speaking quietly, her voice carried strangely clear back to Kyo. "I love Lady Ninir too. I don't want to have to say goodbye to her. Just let us help you defeat this dragon." It was clear that Asuna was delivering her answer to Kyo's earlier statement. "There is no way for me to express my gratitude that you have done so much to save Lady Ninir's life." If I was, in fact, an AI, that would make Asuna one too. But even in that case, the love she felt for the people of this world was still deep and true. It was with this thought in mind that I opened my mouth to say, "I'll help too." "You got me on your side as well," added Argo. "And me, of course," Kismel finished. Kyo fell silent for a while. Eventually she spoke, her voice very quiet. "Thank you." It was the first time I'd ever heard her say those words. No, the second, after Asuna tried to use the healing crystal. But it was this thank you that reached deep into my heart, resonating with me and leaving a lasting glow. Whatever happens, we have to defeat Aguilar and get that dragon's blood, I told myself. This, however, was not something we could achieve on our own, no matter how well we played. Defeating the game's first dragon-type boss would never happen without the help of the two guilds. Speaking of the DKB and the ALS, they were traveling along the road south of the Field of Bones, towards Premio, the final town of the 7th floor. It always took more time when traveling in a big group, but they'd surely reach the town by this evening. They would stay the night, then head towards the Labyrinth Tower early in the morning. If they could reach the boss chamber before noon somehow, we could defeat the boss before Ninir's HP was gone for good. That was an extreme pace compared to the usual speed. But as a matter of fact, we'd finish the 5th and 6th floor on a similar schedule. And both guilds had to have high motivation at the moment. That was because, last night, I'd offer Cabal and Lind not just the Sword of Volupta as a reward, which they'd been desperate to acquire at the casino, but the equally broken Flag of Valor, the wildly valuable guild staff. After we beat the 5th floor boss, and I had earned the flag, I had relayed to the ALS 2 possible conditions under which I would give them the flag. One was if the floor boss ahead dropped the same item. If that happened, I would ensure that both the ALS and DKB each had one flag. The other condition was if the ALS and the DKB merged. In that situation, I would immediately give their unified guild the flag. These conditions were necessary to ensure that the power balance between the guilds wasn't broken, throwing the state of our best group of players into chaos. But even I knew that either of these conditions was going to prove very unlikely. Now we had another item. Not the same as the guild flag, but a weapon with specs and potential on par with it. The Flag of Valor had tremendous supportability, but almost no attack value as a weapon. The Sword of Volupta had no benefit to allies, but offered overwhelmingly strength to the equipper. If I was forced to choose between the two, it would definitely take me hours. I told Lind and Cabal that whichever guild helped more in the fight against the 7th floor boss would be given the right to buy either the flag or the sword at a price of 100,000 coal. Of course, the item that wasn't chosen would be offered to the other guild for the same price. Both men listened in stunned silence, surely because they couldn't believe the bargain they were getting. If we sold both flag and sword at 100,000 each, then we'd be getting back to the 200,000 coal that Asen and Argo, Kyo, and I put in. But considering that Lind offered 300,000 for the guild flag on the 6th floor, I knew that either of them would have paid that much. Still, considering how we got the items, I didn't want to use them as a money-making scheme. And there was a matter of Kyo claiming that there was something she needed to explain to us about the Sword of Volupta. I was about to ask what she'd meant by that, but an instant sooner, Kismel muttered tensely, "The fallen have entered the valley." Up ahead, the two figures had left the edge of the field of bones, walking into a canyon beyond it. It was a place called Ant Tunnel Valley, with cramped ravines and tunnels in a complex three-dimensional arrangement that would get you lost, even with the help of a map. And, like the name said, there were monstrous ants living there. Each one not too difficult, but very quickly to summon more of their kind. If you weren't careful, you'd find yourself surrounded by a huge swarm without an escape route. "I'm guessing they're hideouts in the valley somewhere," Argo murmured ominously. My brow furrowed. There are tons of dead-end tunnels in there too. It's the perfect place for a secret hideout. And it's dry, if not as dry as out here, so no dark elves or forest elves would ever waste their time in there. "Even the monster-capturing team in the Grand Casino hardly ever venture into the valley to capture ants," Gio commented. This was starting to feel like as ominous as the commute to school late on a Monday morning. But Asuna, who knew no fear as long as there weren't ghosts in the area, said crisply, "It's almost showtime. Let's get ready to rumble." She was right. This wasn't the time to be feeling sorry for myself. There was no guarantee the 4 sacred keys would be at the Fallen Elves' hideout, but even if that was true, we'd surely find a clue. For Kismel and for Ninir, I had to give this challenge my very best. Let's try to get closer without drawing attention. The ground is soft in the valley, so we should be able to follow their tracks. But if we lose sight of them, it could be a disaster for us. Asuna, Kismel, Kyo, and Argo nodded with determination. As soon as the two figures reached the entrance to the valley far ahead, we began to run, keeping our footsteps light.